He severed their blood bond for her sister, but the Alpha King claimed her before the entire Coven. On the night of her 100th blood moon, the frail-blooded Isolde expects to be claimed by her resonated bondmate, the future Coven Lord Marius. Instead, at the sacred Crimson Eve ceremony, he publicly severs their bond. Before the entire Onyx Coven, he declares her blood weak and unsuitable, shattering their psychic link and choosing her cruel, ambitious sister, Rowena. Utterly broken, Isolde's unlife is over. But her collapse is witnessed by a silent, terrifying observer. The legendary Alpha King Magnus is present. He's enraged by the insult to the blood progenitor, and captivated by the unique, dormant scent of the rejected woman. Chapter 1. The frail-blood's hope. The air in the Coven Hall was thick and cold, smelling of ancient stone, beeswax, and the sharp, metallic tang of anticipation. It was the Crimson Eve, the one night every century when new bonds were solidified. Isolde, a frail blood of the Onyx Coven, stood near the back, as was her place. Her hands were ice-cold, twisting the simple silk of her dark gown. Tonight was her 100th blood moon. Tonight, her eternity would finally begin. She tried to calm the frantic, silent beat of her heart, but it hammered against her ribs like a trapped moth. For decades, the bond had been a quiet silver hum beneath her skin, a psychic resonance connecting her to him. Marius, the future lord of their coven, their fated bond was the Coven's worst-kept secret, a source of bitter envy, and for Isolde, a fragile, desperate hope. It was the one thing that made being a frail blood, the Coven's lowest-ranking caste, bearable. Her gaze drifted to the front where her older sister Rowena stood among the elite. Rowena was a vision in blood-red velvet, her dark hair gleaming, her laughter loud and confident. She had always overshadowed Isolde, always been the one their sires praised. Isolde felt the familiar, dull ache of inadequacy, but pushed it down. Tonight rank didn't matter. Only the bond the blood progenitor had decreed. The Coven Lord, Marius's father, raised his hands. A profound hush fell over the assembled vampires. Tonight, his deep voice boomed, we honor the progenitor. We honor the bonds that strengthen our bloodlines. We secure the future of the Onyx Coven. The great bell tolled, its vibrations shaking the dust from the rafters. The blood moon crested the high Gothic windows, casting the hall in an ethereal, sickening crimson. Isolde's breath hitched. She could feel it now. The pull. The resonance was flaring, becoming a tangible rope in her gut, tugging her forward. He was close. Marius was feeling it too. He stepped into the center of the hall, a perfect specimen of a high blood. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of command that made others bow instinctively. He was the one she had dreamed of, the one who would finally see her, the one who would elevate her. Marius's cold blue eyes scanned the crowd. See me, Isolde prayed, her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. Please see me. His gaze swept past the front ranks, over his fawning admirers, and finally landed directly on her. He stared, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark in the crimson light. The hall felt silent, shrinking until it was just the two of them. Then his voice, booming with the dominance of his bloodline, cut through the night. Isolde. He had called her. A dizzying wave of relief and joy washed over her. The whispers around her confirmed it. This was it. Come, Marius commanded. Her legs shaking, Isolde obeyed. She pushed past the other frail bloods, her head held high for the first time in her life. She walked toward her destiny, her fated mate, her future. She was so focused on his face that she almost missed the look in his eyes. It wasn't the warmth of a destined lover. It was cold, sharp, and full of a contempt she had never seen before, but she was already moving, already committed. The entire Coven's attention was fixed on her as she stepped into the center of the crimson-lit hall. Chapter 2. the crimson zenith. Isolde stood frozen in the center of the hall. A sacrifice offered to an angry god. The silence was absolute, heavier and colder than the stone walls. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but the only ones she could see were Marius's. They were as cold and hard as chips of obsidian. The love she thought she'd seen in them for years was a phantom. A story she had told herself. This was the real Marius. Marius, she whispered, the sound stolen by the heavy night air. Her bond was a live wire, screaming mate, 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 while her instinct screamed danger. He didn't answer. He simply watched her, his expression a mask of bored calculation. From the corner of her eye, Isolde was vaguely aware of the guests of honor on the raised granite dais. The Coven Lord, Marius's father, sat beside an empty seat with other visiting dignitaries. It was said a representative of the Alpha King himself was present, a formality for the ceremony of a prominent coven. Isolde's humiliation was not just private, it was political. Marius let the silence stretch, wringing every drop of power from it. He let her tremble, let the coven's whispers start to rise. A frail blood. Someone hissed. He can't be serious. Another murmured. Marius raised a hand and the whispers died instantly. He looked at her, but he spoke to the coven, his voice a polished, confident baritone. We gather under the progenitor's eye to secure the future of our coven. A future that must be powerful. A future that must be pure. A future that cannot be built on a mistake of fate. Mistake. The word hit Isolde like a physical slap. The joy and relief that had carried her to the center of the hall curdled into a cold, sickening dread. For years, Marius continued, pacing slowly around her, we have assumed the progenitor's will. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the sharp scent of iron and old wine on him. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, cruel tone meant only for her, though the entire coven watched. Did you really think, he sneered, that you could be lady of this coven? Did you really think I would bind myself to weakness? Her breath hitched. The hope that had been her only shield for a century began to crack. She looked to his father, the Lord, but he was watching his son with a guarded expression, making no move to intervene. Marius straightened up, his face hardening as he turned back to the crowd. He took a deep, theatrical breath. The blood moon was at its absolute zenith, its white light pouring down on him like a spotlight. He was the perfect picture of a future lord, and he was about to pass his first sentence. His eyes met hers one last time, devoid of any warmth, any history, any mercy. Our future must be strong, he declared, his voice ringing with finality. He pointed a single damning finger directly at her. Chapter 3. I renounce you. I, Marius, future lord of the Onyx Coven, he roared, his voice amplified by a preternatural power that sent shivers down every spine. Do publicly renounce you, Isolde, as my fated bondmate. The word renounce struck Isolde with the force of a physical blow. It was not just an emotional wound, it was a spiritual cataclysm. A searing, blinding pain erupted in her chest as the silver psychic thread of their bond, the one she had felt since she was young, was not cut, but torn. It felt like her very soul was being ripped in half. She gasped, a strangled, inhuman sound, and stumbled back, clutching her chest as the agony brought her to her knees. The coven gasped as one. This was not a simple severing. This was a public execution of a sacred pact. Marius watched her collapse with a look of profound disgust. The blood progenitor was mistaken, he spat, his voice dripping with arrogance. He pointed to her, a trembling, weeping heap on the ground. Our coven cannot be led by weakness. We cannot be represented by this, he sneered, the sound echoing in the horrified silence. Her blood is weak, she is unsuitable, and she is nothing but a frail blood. The last word was a curse. The pain in her chest flared white-hot and blinding. She couldn't breathe. The world was tilting, the crimson moonlight turning sickly and grey. She could hear the whispers now, the shock giving way to murmurs of agreement. He was the Lord. His word was law. If he said she was weak, she was weak. Her world had shattered. The one person who was supposed to be her destiny, her protector, her other half, was the one wielding the knife. She looked up, desperate through a haze of tears, and she looked at Marius's father, who sat stone-faced. She looked at the Coven members she had known her whole life, who now looked away, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. She was alone. She was nothing. Marius drank in the sight of her, broken and kneeling before him. A small, satisfied smirk played on his lips. He had done it. He had unburdened himself of his fated duty. But the ceremony was not over. The Coven still needed a lady. "My Coven," Marius announced, his voice smooth and confident once more, "deserves a real lady, a strong lady, one I have chosen." The pain was still a tidal wave, drowning her. But through it Isolde heard his words, her vision blurred. Chosen. He was turning away from her. He was scanning the crowd. His eyes landed on someone in the front rank, among the elite. A triumphant smile lit his face. Isolde on her hands and knees followed his gaze. He was moving, his purpose clear. He was walking toward the one person she had always loved, always trusted. He was walking toward her sister. Chapter 4. The Sister's Betrayal. Isolde's mind, numb and buzzing with the agony of the broken bond, struggled to process what she was seeing. Marius wasn't just walking toward Rowena. He was walking for her. Rowena, her beautiful, popular, perfect older sister, stepped forward from the crowd. There was no surprise on her face, no sisterly concern for Isolde, who was still bleeding her soul onto the cold stone of the hall. Instead, a slow, triumphant smile spread across Rowena's face. It was a look of pure, calculated victory. This was not a surprise. This was a coronation. Marius reached her and, without a word, grabbed Rowena by the waist. He pulled her into a deep, passionate and possessive kiss, right in front of Isolde, right in front of the entire Coven. It was a brutal, public declaration. A branding. The Coven's stunned silence turned into a new, confused murmur. This was a betrayal beyond reckoning. Marius broke the kiss, but he kept Rowena plastered against his side. He lifted her hand, his eyes blazing with pride. "This is your future lady," he roared. "Rowena, my chosen mate." For a moment the Coven hesitated. To reject a fated bond was a profound insult to the progenitor, but to defy a future lord was Coven's suicide. Slowly a few scattered claps began, then a few more. Within moments the hall was filled with a ragged, uncertain but growing cheer. They were choosing their lord. They were choosing power over fate. They were choosing Rowena over Isolde. The sound of their applause was a second assault. Isolde, forgotten on the ground, felt the last of her strength leave her. She looked up, her vision tunneling, her breath coming in shallow, painful rasps. Through the haze of her tears, she saw her sister. Rowena was looking right at her, over Marius's shoulder as he nuzzled her neck and accepted the Coven's adulation. Rowena's eyes met Isolde's. She didn't look away. She held her sister's broken gaze, and she smirked. It was a small, vicious, knowing expression that said, "You never had a chance. He was always mine." The dual betrayal, her mate, her sister, was a final killing blow. The agony in her chest, the public humiliation, and the crushing weight of that single, triumphant smirk was more than her spirit could bear. The world went black at the edges. Her body, no longer able to support even her grief, gave out. Isolde collapsed, unconscious, onto the cold stone floor. The last sound she registered was the Coven cheering for Marius and Rowena. But as her consciousness faded, a new sound cut through the celebration. It was not a cheer. It was a low, resonant growl that vibrated in her very bones. It was a sound of ancient, cold, and absolute fury. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the King. The cheering for the new lord and lady died instantly, frozen in the Coven's throats. The air, which moments before had been filled with celebration, suddenly became heavy, cold, and electric with dread. That growl had not come from an onyx coven vampire. It was too deep, too old, too saturated with the power that choked the breath from their lungs. The Coven Lord, Alden, had been rising to his feet to congratulate his son, a politically necessary, if uneasy, smile on his face. He froze. "My son has made his choice," he began, but his voice faltered as the growl echoed again, this time seeming to come from everywhere at once. The pressure in the hall dropped. The crimson moonlight seemed to dim as if a great cloud had passed over the moon. A terrifying ancient power rolled over the assembly like a physical wave, pressing down on every vampire. It was pure, unadulterated dominance. Frail-bloods and lesser-borns were forced to their knees. High-bloods and even Marius himself bowed their heads, their inner beasts whining in submission. Lord Alden was forced to bend his knee, a profound act of submission in his own hall. This was not Coven authority. This was the authority of the world. Every eye, wide with terror, turned to the raised granite dais reserved for the guests of honor. A figure was emerging from the deep shadows, stepping into the dying crimson light. He had been a silent observer, a formality. He was interfering now. It was King Magnus, the legendary ruthless Alpha King, the ruler of all covens, the last of the ancient bloodline. He was a myth of terror told to disobedient fledglings. And he was here. He was tall, dressed in dark, severe leathers that made no sound, and he moved with a fluid grace that was more predator than man. His power radiated from him in visible, suffocating waves. But it was his eyes that held the Coven captive. They were not the blue, brown, or even red of a normal vampire. They were burning with an unnatural molten gold light. And they were not looking at Marius, the new lord. They were not looking at Rowena, the new lady. They were not looking at Lord Alden. His gaze, blazing with a terrifying cold fury, was fixed on the small broken form of the rejected frail-blood, lying unconscious in the dirt. Chapter 6. The Progenitor's Insult. King Magnus stood over her, a mountain of shadow and power. The Coven was so quiet he could hear the frantic, silent pounding of their hearts. They were terrified, as they should be. He had come to the Onyx Coven to observe. Their lord, Alden, had been petitioning him for greater territory, and Magnus had come to judge his worthiness, to see how he ran his coven, how he honoured the old ways. And this was what he found: a circus, a sacrilege. His golden eyes were fixed on Isolde. He could smell the spiritual rot of her broken bond, a scent like ozone and ash, a perfume of profound agony that offended his ancient sensibilities. This was a direct, public, and arrogant insult to the blood progenitor. A fated bond was their most sacred gift. To reject it was spitting in the progenitor's face, to do it with such theatrical cruelty. It was a declaration of hubris that his authority could not ignore. Marius, his foolish bravado evaporating, finally found his voice. "Your Majesty," he stammered, his dominant tone cracking under the pressure of the king's. "This is a simple Coven matter. She was unsuitable. She is just a frail-blood." The king's head snapped towards him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Marius. The air temperature in the hall dropped by 20 degrees. Marius choked on his next word, the air freezing in his lungs. The king's aura flared, a suffocating blanket of pure dominance that forced Marius back to his knees. Just a frail-blood. The words echoed in the king's mind. He had ruled for millennia. He had seen Coven lords rise and fall. He knew power when he saw it, and he knew arrogance. But as he looked back at the woman on the floor, he smelled something else, beneath the agony, beneath the scent of weak blood. It was faint, buried deep, but it was there. A scent of winter pine, ancient stone, and a spark of dormant, fiery magic. It was a scent that had no business being in a frail blood. It was a scent that called to him. His rage, which had been a cold, calculated thing, now had a new personal edge. These fools hadn't just insulted the progenitor, they had broken something precious. He ignored Marius's pathetic wheezing gasps. He ignored Rowena, who was hiding behind her new mate, her pretty face a mask of terror. He ignored Lord Alden, who was trembling on his dais. His entire world narrowed to the woman on the ground. In a move that sent a tidal wave of shock through the Coven, King Magnus, the ruthless Alpha King, knelt in the dirt. He knelt before the rejected frail-blood. He reached out a single black-gloved hand, his movements slow, deliberate. His fingers, a symbol of so much death and power, hovered over her tear-streaked face. He brushed a matted strand of hair from her cheek. She was cold, lifeless. "They did this to you," he whispered so low only he could hear. He hooked his gloved hand under her chin, his touch firm. Awaken. Chapter 7. The King's Resonance. The command was not a request. It was an ancient law, imbued with a power that bypassed her broken consciousness and spoke directly to her soul. Isolde's eyelids fluttered. She was trapped in a black, agonizing void, the pain of Marius's rejection the only thing that existed. But this voice, it was a new sun, burning through the darkness. She was forced to obey. Her eyes, dull, glassy, and swimming with unshed tears, opened. They were empty. She was a shell, her spirit already half gone. Her unfocused, broken gaze drifted up and met his. The world ended. It was not a gentle hum, not a silver thread of fate. It was a cataclysm, a supernova of destiny. The moment her broken blue eyes met his burning gold ones, a bond exploded into existence. It was a golden, fiery, and furious connection that slammed into them both with the force of a physical blow. Isolde gasped, a ragged, desperate intake of breath. The bond, a king's bond, a primal resonance, seized her very essence. It was a power so vast it was terrifying. It surged from Magnus into her, a tidal wave of ancient strength, and it met that tiny, dormant spark deep within her own soul, fanning it into an inferno. For Isolde, the agonizing, tearing pain of Marius's rejection was instantly and utterly incinerated. It was vaporized as if it had never existed. In its place, this new golden power flooded her, mending the tear in her spirit, sealing the wound in her soul. It was warm, it was absolute, and it was possessive. For Magnus, it was a shock that rocked him to his core. He, who had lived for thousands of years, who had long assumed his fated mate was dust, had found her here. Now, a broken child kneeling in the mud, rejected by a pathetic Coven pup. Gee, the scent he'd detected, pine and stone and magic. It was her. It was his. His rage, already a mountain, became a volcano. This was not just an insult to the progenitor. This was not just the breaking of a Coven frail-blood. This was a direct, personal, and unforgivable assault on his queen. Isolde's eyes, which had been empty, suddenly focused. She was no longer looking at a terrifying stranger. She was no longer looking at a king. She was looking at the other half of her own soul. The pain was gone. The confusion was gone. There was only him. Magnus's face, which had been a mask of cold fury, twisted into something far more dangerous. He rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his golden eyes burning with a new, terrifying purpose. He had not just found an injustice, he had found his mate. Chapter 8. Delivered to me. The power radiating from the king and the frail-blood was a tangible thing, a crackling golden aura that shimmered in the crimson light, pushing back against the cold. Isolde was still on her knees, but she was no longer a heap. Her back was straight, her head high. Her eyes, now clear and sharp, were locked on Magnus. Marius, who had managed to get to his feet, stared in disbelief. The scent of his broken bond with Isolde was gone. replaced by an overwhelming, possessive and ancient scent that was coming from her, from the king. What did you do? Marius stammered, his voice weak. He took an instinctive step forwards. She was, Magnus snarled. His head snapped to Marius, and this time there was no cold calculation in his eyes. There was only the white-hot promise of death. She was yours to cherish, yours to protect, yours to honor. He took one slow step toward Marius and Rowena. They stumbled back, tripping over each other. Rowena, who had been smirking just moments before, was now as white as the moon above, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond mere Coven politics. You! Magnus hissed, his voice a low, deadly vibration. He pointed a single black-gloved finger at Marius, mimicking the gesture of rejection Marius had used on Isolde. You have rejected your destiny. You have defiled a sacred bond. You have cast aside the one chosen for you by the progenitor. He paused, a cruel, cold smile touching his lips. He let his gaze slide to Rowena, who whimpered and tried to hide behind Marius. You cast her aside, Magnus's voice dripped with contempt, for this, for ambition, for a worthless, hollow-hearted... He cut himself off, his fury too great for simple insults. He turned back to Marius, his eyes blazing. And in your arrogance, he continued, his voice rising to a thunderous, dominant roar that shook the very stones, in your blindness you have delivered her to me. The last two words were a shockwave, and Magnus stalked back to Isolde. He didn't offer his hand. He gripped her arm, his touch firm and possessive, and pulled her to her feet. He hauled her against his side, tucking her small frame against his, a clear, unmistakable gesture of ownership. She stumbled, her legs still weak, but he held her up, his arm a band of steel around her waist. Marius stared, his mind finally, sluggishly comprehending the sheer scale of his mistake. No, he whispered, you can't, She's a frail-blood, she's nothing. Magnus actually laughed. A short, harsh and terrifying sound. He looked down at Isolde, his golden eyes momentarily softening as he took in her shocked but steady gaze. He turned his head, looking directly at the horrified, prostrate Coven. Witness, he commanded. Witness what happens to a gift of the progenitor when it is given to one who is worthy. Chapter 9. The Claiming. No, Marius screamed, a desperate broken sound. He lunged forward, his Coven Lord instincts finally overriding his fear, driven by a sudden, agonizing wave of jealousy. He couldn't understand. She's mine! He didn't make it 2 steps. King Magnus didn't even look at him. He simply flared his aura, and an invisible wall of power slammed into Marius, throwing him backward as if he'd been hit by a battering ram. He crashed to the ground, skidding on the stone. She, Magnus snarled, his eyes flashing, is everything. He turned his full attention back to Isolde. She was trembling, not from fear but from the raw volcanic power of the king's bond singing in her veins. It was a roaring lion where Marius's bond had been a dying bird. Magnus lifted his free hand, his bare fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his gaze possessive. They will never hurt you again, he vowed, his voice a low promise that was more binding than any oath. She believed him. He tilted her head, exposing the pale, vulnerable skin of her neck, right where a fated mark should have been. She drew a sharp, sudden breath, her eyes locking with his. There was no question in his gaze, no hesitation. There was only certainty. This was not a choice. This was destiny. You are mine, he growled. He lowered his head. He didn't just nip, he didn't just mark, he claimed. His fangs, longer and sharper than any normal vampire's, extended. He sank his teeth deep into the claiming spot, branding her, binding her body and soul to him for eternity. The moment his fangs pierced her skin, the king's bond detonated. It was not pain, it was a blinding, healing, ecstatic fire. The last spiritual shards of Marius's broken bond were instantly incinerated. Isolde screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated power. Her bones felt as if they were being reforged, her blood turning to liquid gold. The ancient strength of the king's lineage flooded her, not as a gift, but as an awakening. It unlocked a power that had been dormant in her own bloodline for generations. A visible wave of golden energy erupted from her, a shockwave of pure magic that blasted outward, forcing the entire coven to shield their eyes. Magnus lifted his head, his lips stained with her blood. He licked the wound clean, his tongue sealing the mark. It healed instantly, leaving behind a new, intricate and glowing golden mark, the mark of a queen. Isolde's eyes, which had been filling with tears, flew open. The terrified pale blue of the frail blood was gone. They were now a bright, sharp and startling shade of sapphire, ringed with the same unnatural burning gold as his. She was no longer Isolde, the rejected. She was Isolde, the claimed. Chapter 10. The Departure. The hall was silent, save for Marius's ragged, choked sobs. He was kneeling, staring at the golden mark on Isolde's neck. His face was a mask of profound, soul-shattering regret. The bond, his bond, was truly gone, and the void it left was a black hole of agony that he would never recover from. Isolde stood tall, her hand resting on the king's chest. The world was new. The colours were sharper, the smells overwhelming. She could smell the sour, acidic fear coming from Rowena. She could smell the acrid, sickening self-loathing pouring from Marius. And beneath it all, she could smell him. Magnus, her mate. He smelled of pine, of ozone, of ancient stone, and absolute, unshakable power. The new golden energy hummed in her veins, a comforting, heavy weight. King Magnus kept her tucked against his side, his arm a possessive shield. He surveyed the stunned, prostrate coven. His gaze was glacial. "The Onyx Coven," he stated, his voice flat and void of all emotion, "is in disgrace. You have insulted your progenitor. You have permitted the desecration of a sacred bond. You have wronged your queen." The word queen struck the coven like a physical blow. A new, desperate wave of prostration rippled through the crowd. Lord Alden, his face pressed into the stone, pleaded, "Your Majesty, Queen Isolde, forgive us. We did not know. It was my son." "It was," Magnus agreed, his voice deadly. He looked at Marius. "A mistake he will have a lifetime to regret." Rowena, her mind finally snapping, let out a hysterical laugh. No, it's a trick. I'm the lady. He chose me. She's a frail-blood. She's nothing." "Be silent," Isolde said. Her voice was quiet. It was not a shout. It was not a plea. But it was laced with the new golden power of her bond, and it carried the authority of the king. Rowena's hysterical shrieks cut off instantly, as if her throat had been squeezed shut. The entire coven flinched. Isolde, the frail blood, had just commanded silence, and she had received it. Magnus looked down at her, a flicker of dark pride in his golden eyes. "There is nothing for you here," he said, his voice softer, "for her alone." Isolde looked at the coven members who had scorned her. She looked at her sister, who was now weeping silent, furious tears. And she looked at Marius, the man who had been her sun and stars, and felt nothing. Only a cold, distant pity. He was pathetic. He was weak. The king was right. She turned her back on all of it. The hall, her family, her entire life. She did not feel a single pang of loss. "Come," Magnus commanded. He began to walk towards the edge of the hall, and Isolde, the once weak frail blood, walked with him, her steps steady, her head high. As they moved, silent black-clad vampires, the king's royal guard, materialized from the shadows, their golden eyes identical to his. They formed a silent, lethal perimeter around their king and his new queen. Isolde took her first step out of the hall, her hand still resting on her mate's arm, leaving her past to rot. She was heading to the king's court, a place of treacherous ancient power. She was terrified. But as she felt the steady, possessive thrum of the king's bond, she was, for the first time in her life, not weak. Chapter 11. The Shadow Court. The journey was a disorienting blur of motion. Isolde was half carried, half led by Magnus through a tear in the air. a shadow walk that bypassed the physical world. One moment, she was in the damp, familiar Coven hall of her past. The next, she was standing on polished black marble, so cold it seeped through the thin silk of her shoes. The Alpha King's court was not a fortress built on a mountain. It was a fortress carved from its very heart. The ceilings soared hundreds of feet overhead, lost in shadow, held up by massive, unadorned pillars of black stone. Braziers burned with a cold blue fire that cast long, dancing shadows but provided little warmth. The air was dry and ancient, smelling of dust, ozone, and the overwhelming territorial scent of hundreds of powerful, unfamiliar vampires. If the Onyx Coven had been a stage, this was a pantheon. Her simple gown, still stained with dirt from the hall floor, felt like a beggar's rag. The vampires here were dressed in dark rich velvets, furs, and leathers. They were all tall, all beautiful, and all terrifying, and every single one of them had stopped to stare at her. "His Majesty has returned," a voice cried out, but it was unnecessary. Every vampire in the vast hall had already dropped into a deep, respectful bow. Magnus didn't slow, his arm still a possessive band of steel around her waist. He strode through the parting sea of powerful beings, his boots echoing with sharp and authoritative clicks on the marble. Isolde was towed in his wake, her heart hammering. This was a court of predators. She had been a frail-blood, the lowest of the low for her entire life. Now she was surrounded by beings who were to a Coven lord what a lord was to her. She felt their eyes on her, a physical weight of suspicion. She could hear their whispered, sibilant thoughts, a low buzz in her mind she couldn't quite decipher, a new and unsettling ability. She saw their gazes drop to the glowing golden mark on her neck, then rise to her face with a mixture of shock, confusion, and undisguised contempt. They too smelled the frail blood on her. They smelled the weakness of her former Coven. "A wolf," one woman hissed, her eyes like emerald chips of ice. "She is marked," another breathed, his hand going to his chest in shock. "They will learn," Magnus growled, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. He didn't seem to care about their opinions. He just kept walking, pulling her toward a massive throne carved from a single piece of obsidian. He finally stopped, turning to face the hall, pulling her in front of him, his back to the throne. He kept her tucked against his chest, his chin resting protectively over her head. He was presenting her. A high-ranking, silver-haired male stepped forward, his face a mask of polite inquiry. Isolde recognized him from legends. Lord Theron, the king's chief advisor. "Your Majesty, you were gone but a day. What is this?" His gaze fixed on Isolde, his voice sharp and dangerous as he uttered the next words. "Who is this?" Chapter 12. A King's Protection. King Magnus looked down at the silver-haired vampire. Lord Theron's face was a web of aristocratic lines and cold intelligence. "This," Magnus said, his voice flat and absolute, "is Isolde, my mate, your queen." A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the hall. Theron's eyes widened, his gaze flicking from the king's implacable face to Isolde's wide sapphire gold eyes. His gaze lingered on her cheap, torn gown and the dirt on her cheek. Queen," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "From where does she hail, my king? She smells of her destiny," Magnus cut him off, his voice dropping to a dangerous chill. "Which I might add, is now my destiny. And yours. You will all show her the respect she is owed." He began to turn, intending to dismiss them, but a young, arrogant vampire from the back, his face flushed with indignation, pushed his way forward. Isolde recognized his Coven colours. Lord Coven, known for his ambition and his cruelty. "But Majesty, she is a wolf," he sneered, using the high blood slur for a lesser vampire. "A frail blood from the scent of it. She is unworthy." The word unworthy echoed in the vast hall, a clear-toned bell of defiance. It was the same word Marius had used. A tremor of her past trauma, a cold, sickening fear shot through Isolde. She instinctively flinched, her new power faltering. She had underestimated the king's speed. He moved so fast he was a black blur. He was no longer holding her. He was across the hall, his hand wrapped around Corvin's throat, lifting him clear off the marble floor. The sound of choking filled the silence. "My king!" Theron gasped, taking a step forward. Magnus held up a hand, silencing him. He held the struggling vampire at eye level, his golden eyes burning with a calm, terrifying rage. "You," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft as the mail clawed at his wrist, "have precisely 5 seconds to apologize to your queen. I suggest you use them." "I can't breathe," Corvin choked out. "That is the point," Magnus said calmly. 4. "Please, Majesty. 3. I. 2. Isolde saw the raw primal fear in Corvin's eyes and stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "Magnus, please." The king's head snapped toward her. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, Corvin still dangling from his grip. He was not a gentleman. He was territorial. He was lethal. And his mate had just been insulted. But she was also his mate, and she had made a request. With a final contemptuous snarl, Magnus threw Corvin across the hall. He crashed into a stone pillar with a sickening crack and slumped to the floor, unconscious, but breathing. Magnus strode back to Isolde in 2 steps, his rage still rolling off him in hot waves. He grabbed her hand, pulling it to his chest. "No one," he growled, his golden eyes boring into hers, "will ever disrespect you again. That is my vow. My protection is absolute. Do you understand?" She nodded, breathless. She understood he was complex, dominant, and frightening. But as she looked past him, she saw the cold, resentful eyes of Lord Theron and the rest of the court. She was protected, but she was not yet accepted. Chapter 13. The Void. Marius's POV. The onyx coven was broken. The sun rose, but its light was blocked by the heavy, ritualistic shutters of the coven hall. The hall, which should have been a place of celebration, was a tomb. It reeked of the king's power and their coven's disgrace. The coven members, who had been forced to witness their lord's humiliation and their frail-blood's cataclysmic rise, were scattered, their faces grey with shock and fear. But for Marius, there was no sun. There was only the void. He sat on the cold stone floor where Isolde had been claimed. The scent of her, that new, terrifying scent of ozone and ancient power, was burned into his senses. But beneath it was the phantom smell of his bond, the one he had torn, the one he had renounced. It was a physical, gnawing emptiness, a black hole in his chest where his soul was supposed to be. He had thought rejecting her would make him feel strong, free, in control. Instead, he felt hollowed out, weak, and unutterably cold. He had cut off his own arm to prove he didn't need it, and now he was bleeding to death. "Marius, Marius, get up!" Rowena's voice was a shrill, grating sound that scraped against his raw nerves. He looked up. She was standing over him, her beautiful face twisted into an ugly, petulant snarl. Her expensive velvet dress was ripped, her hair a mess. "You're just going to sit there," she snapped. "They're gone. She left. That creature took her, and you just let him." "Let him?" Marius croaked, his voice raw. He climbed to his feet, his body aching. He felt the emptiness inside him curdle into a hot, sick irritation. "He is the Alpha King, Rowena. What would you have had me do? Challenge him?" "He insulted you," she shrieked. "He insulted me. He called me hollow-hearted, and Isolde, she looked at me, Rowena couldn't articulate the look of cold pity Isolde had given her. "She's supposed to be nothing. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen." "She's the vampire queen," Marius whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Gods! What have I done?" "Stop saying that." Rowena grabbed his arm, her nails digging in. "Who cares? I am your chosen lady. The Coven must respect me. We will fix this. We will tell them. We will tell them." She was enchanted, that the king was bewitched. Marius ripped his arm from her grasp, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. The ambition that he had found so attractive was now a grotesque, screeching thing. He had rejected his soul for this, for a shallow, grasping, envious woman who hadn't even bothered to check on him, only on her own newfound, now threatened status. The irritation turned to disgust. "Leave me alone, Rowena. Marius, you are the future lord. You will not walk away from me." He turned, the void in his chest a cold, dead weight. "I was a fool," he said, not to her, but to the empty air. "I rejected my destiny." He began to walk away, his steps heavy, haunted. He was leaving her there, alone in the hall. But it didn't matter. He was already alone. But as he stared at the wall, a new, sick feeling began to curdle in the void. It wasn't just regret, it was envy. And he was not the only one who felt it. Chapter 14. The Queen's New Power, Days in the Shadow Court, bled together in a haze of terrifying new sensations. Isolde was housed in the king's personal chambers, a cavernous suite of rooms where the walls themselves seemed to hum with ancient power. She was given new clothes, silks and velvets in dark, regal colours that felt alien on her skin. But the greatest change was internal. The king's bond was a living, breathing thing inside her. It was a constant warm presence at the base of her spine, a hum of golden energy that connected her and always to Magnus. She felt his moods as if they were her own, a spike of irritation from the council chamber, a wave of dark satisfaction as he passed a sentence, a low thrumming possessiveness whenever he was near her. Her own senses were on fire. She could hear the skittering of a spider 100 yards away. She could smell the lie on a courtier before he even spoke. And she was strong. She had accidentally shattered a solid oak table when a serving girl had startled her. This new power was raw, though, and frightening. She was a queen, but she felt like a child playing with a blade. Tonight she was alone, pacing the cold marble floor of her chambers. Magnus was in a closed council dealing with the political fallout of his return. Isolde was restless, the silence of the fortress pressing in on her. She walked onto the balcony, a terrifying precipice carved into the mountainside. The wind howled, whipping her hair around her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps, but the sudden sharp pull of the bond, a silken rope tugging at her center. He was here. Magnus stepped out onto the balcony, shrugging off his heavy, fur-lined cloak. He had been in council for 6 hours and he looked weary, the lines around his eyes deeper. "You should be sleeping," he said. His voice was not an order, just a quiet statement. "I can't," Isolde admitted, turning to face him. "It's all too loud." He nodded, understanding. He moved to stand beside her, his presence a shield against the roaring wind. "The bond is settling. It is awakening your own bloodline. The frail bloods of the Onyx Coven were not always so domestic. Your ancestors were strong. I don't feel strong," she whispered, looking at her hands. "I feel breakable." He was silent for a moment. Then he reached out, not with the possessive grip of the king, but with a gentleness that shocked her. He took her hand, his much larger, warmer one enveloping hers. "You are not breakable," he said, his voice a low rumble. He lifted her hand, turning it over. "You have iron in your veins, Isolde. It has just been waiting for a fire to forge it." He traced the lines on her palm, the simple touch sending a jolt of liquid heat straight through her. His golden eyes met hers, and the weariness in them was replaced by that familiar, dark fire. His gaze dropped to her mouth. "You are not a frail blood," he growled. "You are not weak. You are mine." He tugged her hand, pulling her closer. Isolde's heart hammered, not with fear but with a new wild anticipation. She was finally beginning to understand him, and as she looked out over the vast, dark territories, she had no idea that hundreds of miles away, the one person who hated her most was about to make her move. Chapter 15. The Poison of Envy. Rowena's POV. Rowena stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. The Onyx Coven Lord's house was supposed to be a palace. It was a glorified log cabin. She was supposed to be a lady, adored and envied. Instead, she was a pariah. Her life was a nightmare. The Coven, terrified of the Alpha King's wrath, treated her with a cold, fearful disdain. They blamed her. They whispered that her ambition had brought disgrace to them all. Lord Alden had confined them both to the Coven house, his face a constant mask of cold fury. And Marius was the worst. He was a ghost. He barely spoke. He spent his days brooding, his eyes lost in the void, as he called it. He wouldn't touch her. He looked at her with a disgust that made her want to scream. This was not the future she had plotted for. This was not the power she had been promised. "A message!" a young Coven guard shouted from outside. "A message from the Ashenclaw Coven." Rowena ran to the main hall. A travelling vampire was handing a scroll to Lord Alden. "What is it?" she demanded. Alden ignored her, breaking the wax seal. His eyes scanned the parchment. His face, already grim, turned ashen. He staggered back, dropping the scroll as if it had burned him. "What?" Rowena snapped, snatching it from the floor. She read the words. It was a formal decree sent to all covens, announcing the king's new mate, announcing the coronation. "And we celebrate the ascension of his fated, Isolde of the Onyx Coven, to her rightful place as Vampire Queen." Queen! The word was a physical blow. Not just a mate, not just a consort. Queen, ruling over all covens, ruling over her. Rowena's vision went red. A choking, poisonous rage filled her throat. Isolde. Weak, pathetic, snivelling little Isolde, who she had walked over her entire life, was now the most powerful female on the continent. She, Rowena, was trapped in this wretched, broken coven, tied to a useless, broken lord while her sister was being crowned. "No," Rowena whispered, her voice shaking with a terrifying cold fury. "No, I will not allow it." Marius, drawn by the commotion, entered the room. "What's wrong now, Rowena?" he asked, his voice dead. Rowena looked at him, her mind working, a new, vicious and desperate plan forming. The king was powerful, yes, but he was also a male. And males, even kings, were fools. They were easily manipulated by whispers, by suggestions of betrayal. Marius had been. Perhaps Magnus could be too. "Nothing," Rowena said, her voice suddenly sweet, a chilling contrast to the murder in her eyes. "Nothing at all, my love. I was just thinking, Isolde was always so loyal to you." Marius looked at her confused, but Rowena just smiled, a slow, toxic expression. She would frame her sister. She would burn Isolde's new world to the ground. Chapter 16. The King's Council. The roaring wind of the balcony felt miles away, replaced by the heavy, velvet silence of the king's chambers. Magnus had not released her hand. He'd led her back inside to a sprawling map of the territories etched into a massive stone table. The room was lit only by the low blue flames of the hearth, casting their faces in stark shadow and light. The intimacy of the moment was a fragile, dangerous thing, more potent than any public display of power. "The court saw your strength tonight," Magnus said, his voice a low rumble. He finally released her hand, tapping a finger on the map over the lands bordering the Onyx Coven. "When you stopped me from killing that fool, Coven." I didn't mean to undermine you," Isolde said quickly, her old frail-blood instincts flaring up. "You didn't," he cut her off, his golden eyes intense. "You showed mercy. Something this court has not seen in centuries. They are afraid of me," he stated, a simple fact. "But that is a blunt tool. What you did," That inspires loyalty. It is the tool of a queen. He paused, his gaze hardening. But it is also a vulnerability. Isolde frowned. What do you mean? This court, he swept his hand across the room, is a nest of vipers, Isolde. They have served me for centuries out of fear. Now you are here, my fated, my queen. You have a power they cannot understand, and they will test it. They will see your mercy as weakness. They will see your kindness as a flaw to be exploited. He moved closer, his sheer size seeming to absorb the firelight. Your greatest test will not come from an enemy who shouts at the gates. It will come from a whisper in the halls. It will come from someone who smiles at you, someone who offers you comfort, someone who claims to be your friend. A cold premonition slid down her spine. You're trying to scare me. I am trying to prepare you, he corrected, his voice harsh. You are no longer a Coven frail-blood. You cannot afford to trust blindly, especially, he added, his voice dropping, with those from your past. Envy is a poison, and your sister holds a full cup. The sudden mention of Rowena made Isolde flinch. Before she could process his warning, he cupped her chin, his thumb brushing her bottom lip. The analytical cold king was gone, replaced by the raw possessive mate. I will not let them harm you, he growled, but you must learn to see the daggers before they are at your throat. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and the world narrowed to the space between them. The political lesson was over. He lowered his head, and Isolde's breath hitched, her eyes fluttering shut. She felt the brush of his lips, a promise of fire, a confirmation of their bond that she was for the first time ready to accept. But before their lips could truly meet, a sharp, urgent knock echoed through the chamber door. Magnus's head snapped up, a low, frustrated growl rumbling in his chest. Enter, he commanded. Lord Theron swept into the room, his face a mask of grim urgency. He bowed low. Your Majesty, your pardon. An urgent anonymous message has arrived from the Onyx Coven territory. It concerns the Queen. Chapter 17. The Traitor's Whisper. Rowena had penned the letter herself, her hands steady, her mind sharp and clear for the first time in weeks. She had not written it as herself. She had crafted it as a loyal, terrified, Onyx Coven guard, one who had witnessed a terrible truth. She had filled it with the language of devotion, of fear for the king, of a terrible burden of conscience. She'd written that Isolde was a spy, that her rejection by Marius was a long-concocted plan to infiltrate the king's court, that Isolde was still loyal to her true mate, Marius, and that they met in secret. She wrote that Isolde's new power was not from the king's bond, but from dark magic, and that she was plotting to find a way to sever the bond and assassinate the king, placing her real mate Marius on the throne. It was a masterpiece of paranoia. She had given it to a beta-class traveller, Zephyr, along with her last remaining silver jewellery, to ensure its swift and anonymous delivery. And now she waited. The trap was set. In the king's court, Lord Theron held the cheap parchment as if it were a venomous snake. He stood before his king, who had moved to stand in front of Isolde, a protective, immovable wall of fury. It arrived with the trade caravan, Majesty, Theron said, his voice tight, delivered by a human runner, anonymously. Read it, Magnus commanded, his voice lethally calm. Isolde gripped her hands together, the king's warning about whispers echoing in her ears. Theron's eyes scanned the page, his aristocratic features tightening with disgust. She is not what she seems, Your Majesty. The rejection was a lie, a performance to gain your sympathy. Her bond to Lord Marius is not broken. They plot against you. She is a serpent. She will be your end. Theron stopped, unable to continue. The silence in the chamber was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Isolde felt the blood drain from her face. It was so utterly, poisonously Rowena. It was the exact same tactic, a public lie to isolate her, to make her seem treacherous. And it had worked on Marius. Her new, fragile confidence began to crumble. "Magnus," she whispered, her voice shaking. Magnus did not look at her. He held his hand out to Theron. "Give it to me." He took the parchment. His golden eyes scanned the words, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He read it once, then a second time. Isolde's heart hammered so hard she thought it would break her ribs. This was the test. This was the dagger he had warned her about. She could feel the weight of his suspicion, his doubt, a cold pressure against their bond. He had called her merciful, he had called her strong, but he was also a king, an ancient, ruthless ruler who had been warned of vipers, and a perfectly crafted lie had just been dropped into his nest. He slowly refolded the parchment, his movements deliberate. He turned, his golden eyes finding hers. They were not warm. They were not the eyes of her mate. They were the cold, assessing, ancient eyes of the Alpha King. He believes it, she thought, a cold, sickening wave of despair washing over her. Just like Marius, he believes it. Chapter 18. The Seeds of Doubt. The king's silence was a living, breathing monster in the room. Isolde's legs felt weak. She had been ripped from her home, thrust into a world of predators, and the one person who was her anchor, her protector, now looked at her as if she were a stranger, as if she were the lie Rowena had painted. "Magnus," she tried again, her voice stronger, desperate. "You know me, you feel the bond. You know that isn't true." "What I know," Magnus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "is that you were, for a century, loyal to another male. A male you believed was your destiny." He turned from her, pacing toward the hearth. "What I know is that your sister is consumed by an envy that would burn the world to ash. She is capable of this lie." "Then you believe me?" Isolde cried, a surge of relief making her dizzy. "But I also know," he continued, turning back, his face a mask of cold calculation, "that a lie is only dangerous if it is allowed to fester." He held up the parchment. "This traitor's whisper was not just for me, it was delivered to Theron. By now, the entire court is aware of its contents." Isolde's stomach dropped. She understood. The whispers she'd heard when she first arrived, frail-blood, weak wolf, would now be replaced by a new one. Traitor. "They are already suspicious of you," Magnus stated, confirming her fear. "You are an outsider, a frail-blood who became a queen. They want to believe this. They want you to be a usurper. It would make their world make sense again." "So what do we do?" Isolde asked, her newfound regal bearing crumbling. She felt like the 100-year-old frail-blood again, trapped and powerless. "How do I fight this?" "I cannot simply tell the court you are innocent," he said, his voice void of emotion. "I must show them." Then I will testify," she said, lifting her chin. "I will tell them the truth." "No," Magnus said, his word final. "You will not. They will." A new cold dread settled over Isolde. This was not a private matter between mates. This was a political trial. "Magnus, what are you going to do?" He looked at her, his golden eyes burning with the cold fire of a king passing judgment. "I am going to bring the entire disease here and cut it out at the root." He looked past her at Lord Theron, who was watching his king with a hawk-like intensity, waiting for a command. "Theron. Majesty, send a royal summons to the Onyx Coven. Lord Alden, his son Marius, and the Lady Rowena. They are to present themselves to my court within 3 days for the public trial of their queen." Chapter 19. The King's Decree. The decree went out like a thunderclap. It was not a request. It was a royal summons carried by the king's own imperial guard, their black and gold armor a terrifying sight in the struggling Onyx Coven's territory. The news spread through the shadow court like wildfire. The king, in his cold wisdom, was not murdering his new mate in the shadows. He was putting her and her accusers on public trial. Isolde was a prisoner in her own opulent chambers. Magnus had not visited her since the decree. He was, as Theron had politely informed her, making preparations. She was isolated, left alone with the whispers of the court and the cold, sick dread in her stomach. She tried to feel him through the bond, but he was shielded. His presence was a distant, cold star. He was not her mate right now. He was the king. He was her judge. Her newfound confidence was gone, replaced by the ghost of the frail blood she had been. Marius had believed Rowena's lies with no evidence. Magnus, her powerful ancient mate, was now demanding a public trial. Was he just a more calculating version of Marius? Was he, too, just looking for a reason to discard her? An unsuitable frail blood? The doubt was a poison, weakening her, making her question the very reality of the king's bond. On the third day, she was dressed by silent serving women in a gown of deep midnight blue velvet. It was heavy and regal, but it felt like a shroud. Lord Theron appeared at her door, his face impassive. "The king is seated, your majesty. Your coven has arrived." He led her through the echoing, silent halls. The court was not in the great hall, but in the amphitheatre of judgment, a vast, open-air arena carved into the stone, reserved for high treason. The entire Shadow Court nobility was present, thousands of them, their cold, assessing eyes fixed on her as she walked to the centre. Magnus was there, seated on a massive throne of black granite. He was not her Magnus. He was the Alpha King, a figure of terrible, ancient majesty, his face a mask of cold iron. He did not look at her. And then she saw them. To the side, looking small and pathetic under the weight of the court's power, stood what was left of her past. Lord Alden, his face grey and haggard. Marius, who looked like a walking corpse, his eyes hollow, the void in his soul visible to all. And Rowena. She was dressed in her finest, a defiant, if slightly tattered, green dress. When she saw Isolde, she didn't look afraid, she didn't look cowed. A slow, venomous, and utterly triumphant smirk spread across her face. She truly believed she had done it. She believed she had trapped the king and queen, and that she was about to be vindicated. "The trial begins!" Magnus's voice boomed, striking the stone and echoing across the arena. His golden eyes, as cold and distant as the moon, finally settled on her. Queen Isolde stands accused of treason, of conspiring with her former coven to assassinate the king. We will hear the evidence. Bring forth the accuser. Chapter 20. The change of venue. "There is a complication, your majesty," Lord Theron said, his voice low, just as the trial was to begin. He leaned toward the throne. Isolde's head snapped up. She saw Rowena whisper frantically to Marius, who then spoke to his father, who nodded. The anonymous letter stated the treasonous meetings took place on Onyx Coven land, Theron murmured. The accused, they claim the only fair trial is one held on the land of the alleged crime. Lord Alden requests it. It was a ploy. They believe you will not leave your fortress, Theron said. They believe it is a way to stall, to claim an unfair trial later. A dangerous glacial silence fell. Magnus's eyes narrowed, fixed on the small, defiant cluster from the Onyx Coven. Rowena was still smirking. She thought she had found a loophole. "They are mistaken," Magnus said, his voice a low, deadly promise. He rose from his throne, a towering, terrifying figure. The entire amphitheatre gasped. The king was leaving his fortress. "The trial will not be held here," he pointed a single black-gloved finger at the delegation. "This began in their Coven Hall. It will end in their Coven Hall." His voice boomed across the arena. "We ride for the Onyx Coven, now." The journey was a tense, agonizing blur. Isolde rode beside the king, but they were surrounded by his imperial guard. They were not mates. They were a judge and his prisoner. The Onyx Coven trio was transported under heavy guard, their faces a mixture of confusion and, in Rowena's case, growing confidence. She believed the king's dramatic move was a sign of his uncertainty, a way to appease the other covens by showing fairness. When they burst through the shadow fold into the great coven hall, Isolde's breath caught in her throat. It was exactly as she'd left it, but it felt smaller, meaner. The entire Onyx coven was already assembled, forced there by the king's advanced guard. They were kneeling, their faces pressed to the dirt, trembling in terror. This was the same ground, the same crimson-lit hall, the same audience. But she was different. Magnus dismounted. He didn't take Lord Alden's platform. He strode to the exact centre of the hall, the same spot where Marius had renounced her, the same spot where Magnus had claimed her. The ground there seemed to hum, permanently saturated with their combined power. "Here," he boomed, his voice rolling over the terrified coven. "We will have the truth." He turned to his guard, his voice like cracking ice. "Bring the accuser, and bring the accused." Isolde was led forward, her heart hammering. She stood on one side of the king. On the other, Rowena was shoved forward by a guard. She stumbled but caught herself, her eyes blazing with righteous false fury. "I am no accuser," she cried, playing her part. "I am a victim. We all are. Of her." She pointed a trembling, dramatic finger at Isolde. "She has bewitched him. She is a traitor." Isolde met her sister's gaze. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, building rage. This would not be a repeat. "And where," Magnus said, his voice deceptively calm, "is your proof?" "It is in the letter," Rowena stammered, her plan not accounting for this. "The anonymous letter?" Magnus asked, a dangerous silken tone to his voice. "The one you wrote?" Rowena's face went white. "What? No, I would never." "Then," the king said, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face, "you will not mind that I have brought another witness." He turned his gaze to the edge of the hall. "The beta-class traveller, Zephyr, whom you paid with your mother's silver. Bring him forward." Chapter 21. The Trial of the Sisters. 2 of the king's imperial guard marched Zephyr, the beta-class traveller, into the centre of the hall. He was a thin, nervous-looking vampire, his eyes wide with terror as he found himself the centre of attention. Rowena's face went white. She shot a panicked look at Marius, but he was staring at the ground, lost in his own void, oblivious. I don't know who that is," Rowena shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is a trick, a new lie. She has bewitched him just as she bewitched you, Your Majesty." She turned to Magnus, her hands clasped in a desperate false plea. "My king, you are a just ruler. You must see the truth. I saw it. I saw them meeting in secret near the old river. Marius was torn. He still felt the pull of their old bond, and she used it. She promised him power. She promised him your throne." Isolde stood silent, her face pale but her expression cold. She watched her sister weave her tapestry of lies, each word more desperate than the last. Rowena's performance was masterful. She wept. She was accused. She pleaded. She painted a vivid picture of a treacherous frail-blood still hopelessly in love with her first mate, manipulating a grieving lord and a new, trusting king. The Onyx Coven was mesmerized. The whispers started again. It did make a sick kind of sense. Why else would the king take her? She must have enchanted him. Rowena, sensing she was winning them over, grew bolder. "She is a spy," she screamed, pointing that trembling, accusatory finger at Isolde. "She is a traitor to her own coven and a serpent in your bed. I tried to warn you. This anonymous letter, it was the only way. I was afraid for my life, afraid of her." She finished, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She looked like a tragic heroine. She had played her final desperate card. The hall was silent, the tension so thick it was a physical weight. Every eye, royal guard, and coven blood turned to the king, waiting for his judgment. Magnus remained still for a long, agonizing moment, his face a mask of stone. He let the accusation hang in the air, letting its poisons spread. Isolde's heart hammered, a cold dread creeping into her. He had to believe her. Finally, the king turned his cold golden eyes, not to Rowena, not to Zephyr, but to Isolde. "You have heard the accusation." His voice boomed, devoid of all warmth. "What say you, Queen Isolde?" Chapter 22. The Unravelling. Isolde looked at her sister, at the coven that had scorned her, and at the man she once loved. Then she looked at her king. She stepped forward, her regal blue gown sweeping the dirt. Her voice when she spoke was not the whisper of a frail-blood. It was the clear, cold, and resonant voice of a queen. "I say she lies." Rowena let out a sharp, theatrical scoff. "Of course you deny it. Where is your proof, sister?" "I do not need to provide it," Isolde said, her gaze steady. "She is correct." Magnus's voice cut through the air. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on a now faltering Rowena. "Because you already have." He turned to the trembling traveller Zephyr. "Tell this assembly what you told my guard when they found you on the road. Tell them who gave you the letter." Zephyr, trapped in the king's golden gaze, fell to his knees. It was her," he stammered, pointing a shaky finger at Rowena. "The Lady Rowena. She gave me a silver necklace, said it was her mother's, and a bag of coins. She told me to get the letter to the king's court and make sure I said it was from a loyal Coven guard." Rowena reeled back as if struck. "He's lying! He's with her! It's a conspiracy! She got to him!" "Silence!" Magnus roared. The force of his command was a physical blow, knocking Rowena off her feet and onto the hard-packed earth. "You accuse your queen of meeting her former mate in secret by the old river," Magnus said, his voice a casual, deadly purr. "A bold claim, one that would require witnesses." I am the witness," Rowena cried from the ground. "Are you?" Magnus asked, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. He was enjoying this. "Because it is a fascinating accusation, especially since for the entire time, since my queen and I left this territory, your chosen mate, Lord Marius, has been under the constant, invisible surveillance of my imperial guard." Marius's hollow eyes snapped up. Lord Alden gasped, his face turning ashen. "He has not left the Coven house in 3 weeks," Magnus continued. "He has not spoken to anyone in secret. He has spent his days, and I quote from my guard's report, languishing in a state of profound and pathetic self-pity. He has not met with anyone, especially not my queen." The truth landed with the force of a guillotine. The entire Coven stared. Rowena's plot wasn't just a lie, it was an impossible lie. Magnus turned to Isolde, and for the first time in days the cold judicial mask fell. His golden eyes were blazing with a fierce, possessive pride. He had not believed the lie for a single second. He had simply built the stage to watch his enemy destroy herself. Rowena began to sob, a dry, broken animal sound. No, it was supposed to work." She looked from the king's cold face to Marius's horrified one. "It worked on Marius!" she shrieked. "It was supposed to work on you!" The hall was dead silent, staring at the self-confessed traitor. But as Rowena's eyes met Marius's, her expression changed from terror to a new, desperate plea. The king's trap had caught her, but the trial wasn't over. Chapter 23. The Lord's Regret. It worked on Marius. The words echoed in the dead, horrified silence, louder than any roar. Marius stared at Rowena, at the pathetic, weeping creature on the ground. It was true, all of it. He hadn't just been a fool, he had been a tool, a weak, arrogant, and easily manipulated pawn in her desperate, jealous game. The renunciation, the humiliation of his fated mate, the loss of his own soul. It had all been for this. The cold, dead void in his chest flashed hot, not with anger, but with a searing, bottomless self-disgust. He had been weak. He had allowed this poison, to convince him that his own destiny was unsuitable. "Marius," Rowena whispered, her voice broken. She began to crawl toward him, her hands outstretched like a beggar. "Marius, please tell them you love me, not her. Tell them you chose me, please." He recoiled from her touch as if she were a leper. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the beautiful popular woman he had chosen was gone. In her place was a snivelling, treacherous stranger, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with a madness he now found repulsive. His voice when he spoke was dead. "You," he said, the word dripping with a venom that shocked even him, "are a plague." Rowena froze, her hand hovering in the air. "You used me," he continued, his voice rising, gaining a bitter, broken strength. "You poisoned me, against my fated. You helped me destroy my own soul for this. To be lady of a broken coven, and when that wasn't enough, you tried to destroy her again." He looked past Rowena, his gaze landing on Isolde. She was standing beside the king, bathed in a new, cold power, her sapphire and gold eyes watching him with a pity that was worse than any hatred. He saw in that instant everything he had thrown away. He saw the strength he had called weakness. He saw the honor he had called unsuitable. He saw the queen he had renounced. He took a public, deliberate step back from Rowena, severing the last invisible thread between them. "I want nothing to do with you," he spat. "You are no lady of mine. You are nothing to this coven. You are nothing to me." It was a final public rejection, an echo of the one that had started it all. Rowena let out a choked sound as her last hope crumbled. Marius didn't care. He turned his full attention to Isolde. He did the only thing left for him to do. He dropped to his knees, bowing his head in the dirt before the woman he had cast aside. "My queen," he choked out, the words tearing his throat raw. I was a fool. I was blind, arrogant. I rejected my destiny. I am sorry. I will live with that forever." Chapter 24. The Sanguine Queen. All eyes were on Isolde. Her coven, her king, her broken former mate, and her hysterical defeated sister. They all waited for her judgment. Rowena, seeing Marius's final betrayal, let out a wail of complete and utter despair. She was alone. She scrambled across the dirt, her nails digging into the ground, a desperate animal. She grabbed the hem of Isolde's midnight blue gown, her grip frantic. "Isolde, Addie, please," she sobbed, her beautiful face a grotesque mask of snot and tears. "Please, you're my sister. You have to forgive me. I didn't know. I was jealous. I was just so jealous. Please." The proud, popular Rowena, who had smirked over Marius's shoulder, was now a grovelling, broken creature at her feet. The entire Onyx Coven watched, witnessing the final, absolute reversal of power. Isolde looked down at her sister. She felt the cold draught of the hall, the same draught that had chilled her on the night of her renunciation. She remembered the physical, soul-splitting pain. She looked at Rowena's clawing, desperate hands on her dress. Then she looked at Magnus. He was watching her, his golden eyes intense, his expression unreadable. He was not interfering. This was her justice to pass. Slowly, deliberately, Isolde reached down. Rowena's eyes lit with a wild, desperate hope. But Isolde didn't take her hand. She simply unhooked Rowena's fingers from the velvet one by one and took a single step back, breaking the contact. "No," Isolde said. Her voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was quiet, cold, and final, carrying the ancient authority of the king's lineage. "You are not my sister," she said, her voice clear in the silence. "You are a lesson." She turned from Rowena's crumpled form. She looked at Marius, still kneeling, his head bowed in shame. He was a ghost, a living monument to his own arrogance. He would be lord of this disgraced coven, forever bound to his mistake, forever living in the void he had craved. That was a sentence more profound than any she could pass. She had faced her tormentors. She had seen their lies exposed, she had watched them break each other, and she was finally free. Isolde turned her back on her sister's broken sobs and her former mate's hollow regret. She turned her back on the Onyx Coven and the small, sad life she had once been forced to live. She walked across the hall, her steps steady, her head high. She stopped in front of Magnus, the King of Kings, her mate. He held out his hand. She took it, their fingers lacing together, and the power of their bond flared to life, a visible golden aura that shimmered around them both, a silent promise of a new future. He looked down at her, and his harsh kingly features softened into a look of fierce, possessive, and absolute pride. "My queen," he murmured, loud enough for all to hear. He pulled her to his side, and together they turned to face the stunned, silent hall. Isolde, the rejected frail-blood, was gone. In her place stood Isolde, the sanguine queen, her spirit forged in betrayal, her power awakened by destiny, and her future secured at the side of her king. "You were not the love I expected," she whispered, looking up at him, her past finally turning to ash. He smiled, his golden eyes blazing only for her. "I was the love you were forged for. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." Emily Bronte.